Okay, hi. We have a wonderful topic today, which is modernist sculpture. If we're talking about the modernist period, why is it so important to do sculpture? Because in this humanities part two class, I haven't really been covering sculpture very much. But now, when we come into the modernist period at the end of the 19th century, I'm going to do a video about sculpture. Why is that? Well, the thing is, we've seen with looking at the history of painting here, and we looked at French Impressionism, for example. That's kind of the touchstone for this change from into the sort of contemporary period in the 20th century. And we saw the way that this new interest in subjectivity, this new interest in psychology, and this new search for kinds of vision, different ways of looking at things, was very revolutionary for painting. But for a sculpture, it really completely blows the whole thing wide open, because think of the difference between, say, filming live people with your film camera and making animation. Okay, so, and animation, of course, just not to dwell on that, but we are in the very, very infancy of animation as an art form. Animation has a long way to mature, and it will mature in very amazing ways because it's completely plastic. The limit is the limit of your imagination. In a sense, the modernist revolution in sculpture is even more kind of mind blowing when you look at it that way, because you have this idea, not just the painter who's going to be able to paint what they see or what they can imagine or what they can construct out of their ideas. In the case of some of these modernist painters that we're looking at, there's really anything that can be put down on the canvas. Uh, but with sculpture, it really even goes beyond that. I mean, and another thing that's characteristic of sculpture at this time is that the boundaries of what makes a sculpture are also getting to be very exploded, really, quite frankly, sort of deassembled. Um, so, all right, so let's get to our little show here, modernist sculpture. I call it matter over mind. You think of mind over matter, but in a sense here, I mean, for me, as you know, if you know the kinds of things I'm interested in, uh, it's our sort of mind body stereotype is that the artist and the human maybe is sort of molding nature, molding material into some kind of form, that is taking this sort of ideas in their mind and using them to transform the world as sort of Platonic and Kantian rationalist notions. And what we see here is a much more kind of, when I say existential, fancy word, but what do I mean? Just that the artist and the human, right, the thinker, is sort of allowing, or not allowing, but recognizing the fact that it's their material experience that's really sort of shaping in a lot of ways who and what they are. And at a minimum, there's just a strong, completely interwoven dialectic. This bust we see here, by the way, on this slide, I want to mention, is by Picasso. I'm not going to talk about Picasso today because there's a whole other video on Picasso in the series, but um, but Picasso most certainly could be considered one of the major modernist sculptors, not just one, not just someone who had a good oeuvre of modernist sculptures, but actually he's a major influence, a major force. Um, as you can see, this is a bust of a woman, Fernand, I believe, and this is from his Cubist period. So I could have a section on Picasso, but I'm not going to. But I just mention it. Also, Gauguin, who paints the Polynesian paintings, actually has serious sculptures, as does Degas. And those are other people we've already talked about. We're going to talk about four other sculptors today. As I say, the most certainly, without a doubt, the most important sculptural revolution since the Renaissance, and it's easy to show why that is. I was just talking about that, the radical change that these ideas of what it is that the artist is expressing and how the artist should try to go about expressing those things radical implications that those ideas had for sculpture, which then becomes, in a sense, the ultimate plastic medium. Um, we're going to look at Henry Moore, and I think when we look at Henry Moore's sort of biomorphic shapes, as they're sometimes called, nonlinear shapes, we are going to see what this means. I mean, I sort of think of a white material like what Henry Moore uses, and you could just make anything out of it. But it even goes beyond that, because modernist sculpture also is synthetic in the sense of synthetic cubism, in the sense that you get all sorts of mixed media installations and a lot of other things. And these artists of this period really pioneered all of that stuff: collage, installation, found art. All of that is from this period, from the turn of the century up through the 20s and 30s. Of course, we can only brush the surface of that. So yeah, the plasticity of the form made the new psychology, the new subjectivity, absolutely transformative for sculpture. That's the first bullet point. The second bullet point, motion and shape itself. I mean, it seems sort of even paradoxical in a sort of classical or traditional sculptural context to talk about shape as being of what? I mean, the approach to shape, the idea that you could say something about shapes in general, and also think of motion. I mean, obviously a statue in a sort of classical sense is a stationary thing. Classical statues, like Greek statues, for example, often are portraying people in action. Obviously the body is in action, but the sculpture is stationary. And I think we already saw with the Cubists a sort of different approach to trying to convey motion. We saw that also, speaking of found art, with Marcel Duchamp and his nude descending a staircase, remember. So, so third bullet point, you see this, this movement. I think one of the most important things to understand, or try to understand if it's something that can be understood, is the movement from the whole tradition of art into the 20th century into abstract and non-representational art. And, as lay people, we look at that and we think, well, what is the explanation for that? I mean, you either like the art of the 20th century or you don't. I think it's wonderful art. But another question is, what is motivating this? What are the ideas under these transformations? And as I say, these are psychological and philosophical ideas, as well as even physical ideas. And we talked about that influence of relativity, understood or misunderstood as it might have been. And as I said, the last bullet point on the slide here, then, just speaking about modernist sculpture in general, before we look at the specific sculptors, you have disintegrating boundaries. The map sculpture here mapping on very much to, in the philosophy of art and aesthetics, the whole issue of sort of what an art object is and what defines, the extension of the set of art objects, what makes something an object of art, different theories of art. Excuse me. And that whole conversation is happening parallel to modernist sculpture. So let's take a look at some of it and you'll see. Auguste Rodin, one of the very best, an early person, a forerunner, a person who stands on his own. He was a craftsman. Rodin's training and experience was working for a very sort of high-class company of designers and decorators who worked with builders, building, custom houses for people and for governments and so on. And Rodin was one of their, house talents, building just anything you needed, a staircase, a railing for a staircase, or a doorway, or a lintel for a window, or painting the doorknobs, or making the ornaments for the roof. And Rodin did this kind of stuff, and he did it so well that he actually got to be a pretty well-known talent working in the private sector as a craftsman for high-end designers. He always thought of himself as significant because of his technological innovations. And indeed, uh, bronze casting in particular does owe a lot to Rodin, and his techniques continue to be fascinating today. Those two things together, that background that he has, uh, art critics and historians will tell you that it is in the molding of the clay models that we really see an artist who appears to be an artist of great genius. Rodin, a workshop artist running a big workshop, uh, has people who work for him who take some of his smaller plaster models, for example, and render them into much larger sizes, scaling up and scaling down. Uh, just like some of those Baroque painters, we see Rodin with a big studio and a bunch of people working for him. Uh, so he is a workmanlike person, and that is his attitude too. He gets up in the morning and goes to work and tries to make these things. He's very uncompromising. He will only do it the way that he will do it. We call him naturalistic. You'll see these figures to me. I mean, they're only naturalistic in the sense that they're not formalistic figures, but they seem to me to be like mannerist figures, like the figures from El Greco. Uh, they're not very realistic. I see what he means by naturalistic. Rodin doing mostly figures and fascinated with the figure. All right, so um, I think if there's a thesis about modernist sculpture, it's this breakdown of it's what happens to this kind of plastic art when the mind body distinction kind of breaks down the way that we see it breaking down in this period. And so there's a sort of attempt to evoke an inner psychological state from the surface and the form. And I think that's something that characterizes the modernist period in general. The first bronze cast that Rodin ever showed publicly was The Age of Bronze, which he did in 1877. It's so realistic that Rodin actually had a really hard time for a long time because many people accused him of casting it from a human body. They just simply didn't believe that he had carved this, rendered this in plaster, and then made a bronze cast of it. And so, one of the things that Rodin, I think I mentioned before, does is make his sculptures deliberately larger or smaller than life. Sometimes he says he does that so that people won't accuse him of this crime. There's a French word for it, for lying and saying that you actually made the sculpture when really you cast it from a person. Rodin never did that. So for many years, Rodin worked on a commission from the government. It was a way for the government to help Rodin. He had friends in the government because he was admired for his art. This building that the Gates of Hell, the building, the bronze cast door that he made, was never built. Because these are bronze castings, you can make multiple copies of these things. They're kind of like prints that way. And not only that, but Rodin would make a bunch of different plaster casts of the same kind of figure for the gates of. So there are a number of gates of hell that you can see. One of them's in Philadelphia, as I mentioned. I'll talk about that in a second. On this doorway, he made over 186 figures. And small scenes on the gates of hell. It's what it says it is. It's the way to hell, including some of his most famous things. Probably the most famous sculpture by Rodin is the Thinker that we're going to look at. I did want to mention while we're talking about the gates of hell, in Philadelphia, if you go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is where Rocky Balboa is running up and down the stairs in the movie, on the way, if you're on the main road, just going up to the Philadelphia Art Museum, on your right is another smaller building, which is the Rodon Museum, because there was a wealthy couple in Philadelphia who collected Rodin and actually built that building. And there's a pretty nice little collection of Rodin there in Philly. So if you're in Philadelphia and you're being a tourist and you're going to go over to the Philadelphia Art Museum, which I suggest because it's a really good one, pull in, before you get there, on the right to the Rodon Museum and check out some of these very, very nice pieces by Rodin that you can see in Philadelphia. I always go there because I have family from Philly, so I always try to go to the Rodin Museum. Last bullet point there, yeah, because of the bronze casting, French law said that you could consider, the law says you can only consider the first 12 casts to be actual works by the artist. I don't know exactly how that works, but that's something that they tried. There it is. Very, very large. That's a 6 foot tall man would be maybe about halfway up that. You see in the middle of the lintel and the above the doorway, you see the thinker. And above him on the top, you see those three sort of dancing figures. And as I say, quite a few of these plaster casts for these various figures that he made for the door were ones that he later on enlarged or made in various casts of. So a big source for him. And again, it was what he was supposedly working on. Rodin would say, and you think about the mind-body and the Cartesians really keeping the strong distinction between the mind and the body and focusing on the sort of otherworldly notion of the mind and the soul all the time. Think about trying to be the opposite of that, and you're a sculptor. So you might think that, well, what kind of sculptor is it? What kind of action is it for the man to be sitting there in contemplation? That could almost be a visual joke, right? You have a sort of monumental, dramatic bronze statue of a man, but what's he doing? He's just sitting there, staring off into space. Is it some kind of joke? Is it supposed to be funny? Or maybe it's mind-body dualist, right? Maybe he's lost in thought, and so he's left us. He's left this world, like guys like the thinker do. But no, Rodin is trying to do the opposite. He's trying to show that everything people do is a kind of full body action. He tried with the thinker, he said, to evoke the whole body being involved in every kind of action, including thinking. So looking at thinking as an essentially physical action. Look at the toes of the figure, kind of holding on to the rock. He said the whole body was thinking. Also from The Gates of Hell, The Kiss, and quite a few different kinds of copies of this. And these beautiful bronze figures that he does, and there are many of these. And Rodin will also, he has a lot of what are called fragments and unfinished things. And sometimes he'll have the figure sort of half emerged out of the rock that he's using, and he'll leave it like that. And some of those, what are called fragments, are really very arresting, but his full figures are very beautiful. And you see that a very large cast of the figures that are at the very top of the Gates of Hell. You can see the Eiffel Tower in the background there. That's at my mom's place in Paris. The hand of God, in this case, showing you the woman in the rock, and you can see the hand coming up out of the rock. He has hands coming out of the rock, and they're very nice. There's a few of these hands. The Cathedral, 1908. That's two right hands, so that's two different people. All right, so Rodin, great. Constantin Brancusi. And what am I doing here, by the way? I'm showing you really my favorites, maybe minus Picasso, but so why am I showing you these ones? Because they're the ones that I think is cool. Again, I'm not a cynical teacher. I'm showing you the ones that I really enjoy the most today. So Brancusi, I really like Brancusi. He's just very wonderful objects that he makes. Brancusi came from a dirt poor family up in the Carpathian Mountains, peasants. He had a father and a bunch of brothers. It was a fairly rough situation. He basically ran away when he was 9 years old to the town and got a job and never went back. But where he came from, they were excellent wood carvers. In fact, as a teenager, when he got the attention of some wealthy people in the town where he was working, and they decided to help him out, send him to art school, one of the things he had done was to make a violin for himself. And they said, well, where'd you get the wood? And he said, well, I just found the wood here and there. And he could do that. He was a woodworker, a wood carver, and primarily a carver as a sculptor. Brancusi he talks about the internal. Brancusi has some concept of his own about the internal and the essence of a thing. I've studied it and read what I could about Brancusi and tried to get to the bottom of what he thought of that. He really has an idea that I don't claim to understand very well, that the exterior visible surface of the object is somehow representational. It seems to me it just is the object, but for Brancusi, it's somehow representational of what he thinks is the essence, and the essence is somehow revealed by the surface. Again, I don't quite understand what he means by that, but I do recognize this fascination with shape and inner form. It's the same fascination that we find in Cézanne, and from Cézanne also then to Picasso. So that last bullet point, what do I mean by that? I said Brancusi would concentrate his attention on the modal possibilities. Modal, that's a fancy word. What does that mean? It just means, well, you could do it this way or you could do it that way. A musician will say, well, that's a song that you could solo to. You could put a good solo on that because of the rhythms and whatever else it is about it that makes it good for that. So with Brancusi, we see someone who's really working again and again and again on getting something very, very basic just the right way. The Kiss from 1907, he reworks this shape very, very many times. I can't say it's my favorite Brancusi. It's a block, and there's sort of the unity of the two people in the block. But he keeps working that. Notice the eyes of these two people, the way the eyes sort of come together to form a circle. And you see here later on, as I say, he works it again and again. Notice the more abstract piece on the right. Again, look at the eyes, and now the eyes have really come together to make that circle with a sphere in it, maybe one eye. And so here is 8 years later. The first Kiss was from 1930. This is part of the Romanian War Memorial that he was commissioned to make at the end of the 1930s. And this is the gate of the Kiss. Just going back, look at that. There it is on the right, and there it is. It's the Kiss still permutating and still turning into different things 8 years later, as Brancusi's still thinking about it. He made these birds, flying bird in space. This is sort of the canonical shape, the iconic Brancusi statue, I would say this is, after quite a bit of evolution of working with the shape of a flying bird. So, and you see there on the left, he had something like a sort of falcon kind of thing going, and then he kept thinking about the shape and working on the shape. And like Giacometti, one of the things Brancusi does is kind of bear it down and keep subtracting and subtracting and subtracting. I really like these busts that he does. There's obviously marble, of course. He also makes bronze ones, and eventually he makes these heads. They're like eggs, and they're very, very finely polished. They're simple objects. I just find them very enjoyable, very sensuous objects, it seems to me, even as you see his sort of minimalist tendencies, obviously, as he goes for abstraction by subtraction. Finally, he starts to get somewhere. And then he does these, again, these are small objects. And another theme of his is this endless column. He does variations on this. This also is part of the War Memorial, like the Gate of the Kiss. Those were two. And there's also a table with chairs around it, is the third element of the War Memorial that Brancusi did in Romania. It was left to molder away during the Soviet communist regime because they thought it was sort of degenerate bourgeois art. So it was in bad shape out in a field somewhere. But then I think UNESCO, the World Heritage Organization, has restored it now. Probably a pretty hard restoration job. So Brancusi, Henry Moore, English. What I like about Henry Moore, I said when I was talking about abstraction in modernist sculpture, you know, just sort of think of a white mass in space, in a black space, and you can mold it into anything you want. And you've got that kind of now plasticity. That's what I mean by modality. The possibilities are absolutely endless. And one of the things that Moore thinks about that makes his sculpture so interesting is, then you think about the surface. So a common sense way of thinking about the surface is, well, this is my object that I'm creating, so I'm making a volume enclosed by the surface. And so my art is the surface and perhaps the volume inside of the surface. Brancusi certainly thought that was a big part of it. But Moore said, yeah, but surfaces, I mean, Aristotle says this too, surfaces actually define space. Surfaces are actually where space comes from. It's the space around the surface. It's because the surface is there that space is there. So the space around the surface is just as much part of the expression of the artist as the volume inside the surface is contained inside the surface. And I mentioned he gives us biomorphic shapes, sinuous curved shapes. He specializes in figures, even sometimes at his most abstract. They tend to be female figures. Reclining figures. But again, sort of part of nature, the artist now part of nature. I say matter over mind. The artist now not trying to conquer nature, the artist now trying to get into and sort of be one with nature. And in the same sense, he makes very large pictures, which are located often outside. They have to be located outside because they're so big. So bearing that in mind, let's check them out. Where are we? Here we are. You can see the similarity to, say, of Mayan. There's a Toltec reclining figure, actually, that Moore saw in a museum somewhere, and then he became fascinated with that figure. This is a pretty close copy of it. And then he went on with this theme of reclining figures. And he makes mother-child pieces and family pieces. And I mentioned biomorphic shapes. I mean, he's very interested in sort of life, biology, and he equates that, I think, also with this kind of nonlinear and expressionistic style. Very typical idea. He started off early with sort of the spaces between arms and torsos and the ordinary kind of spaces that human figures have. And in his progression towards abstraction, he starts to have holes through the torsos and that kind of thing. Reclining figure from 1967. Some of these are very large. And endless studies. What makes a great artist? They work it and they work it and they work it some more. So that's the quintessential. More people see these big blobs, but when you understand what the art is, you understand more what you're looking at. And the idea that they're figures, I think, is really interesting. Even some of his more abstract ones, like one called Vertebrae, but nonetheless, it's anatomical. You can see that vertebrae idea working in this very beautiful object. You might not think that that's a vertebrae, but once you know it, as you can see it, oval points from 1968, a very large object. And that idea about defining, that your object is sort of also colonizing all the space that's near it, and it's part of the object. The object isn't just an object. A surface isn't just an object. A surface is an interface between two regions. And so consequently, you think about nature installations and that kind of thing, more very influential in all of that. Okay, Giacometti, frankly philosophical sculpture, a surrealist sculpture. Thinking about existentialism, you can't miss it. In fact, we look at those sort of kitschy pictures of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza that are all elongated, and this is sort of the Giacometti message. Absurd and tragic and fragile, and at the same time kind of oblivious to all of that. Not just elongated, but his surfaces are very rough and corroded, and this also really creates gives you a certain attitude towards the figure and towards existence. And the last bullet point there, thinking about urbanity and sort of rushing around and walking down the street and running up and down in buildings and that sort of thing. And that's also something that's expressed by these figures that he has. This one's, I mean, gosh, it sure does work. It's like, it looks like a chicken is looking at you, kind of like, wow. But these are the iconic Giacometti figures, these elongated human figures that he does. Again, he's just talking about the human condition. Men and women, groups of people, and animals as well, such as his existential, suffering, but ill-defined cat. And there's your basic Giacometti, again, walking. He's moving. They're going somewhere. Where are they going? I don't know. They're walking down the street. Giacometti, like Brancusi, is paring down, taking away, trying to get down to some kind of essence underneath. All right, that's how big they are. Okay. Well, modern sculpture, wonderful stuff. Just touch the surface. Pardon the pun. There are dozens and dozens of good sculptors during this period. It's one, as I say, it's really obviously, and I explained to you why, you can see why for yourself. Again, take it or leave it, but you can see for yourself why it's certainly one of the very most important periods in all of the history of sculpture. Since classical times, really, and no exaggeration at all. And the final realization of the ultimate plasticity, ultimate plastic art. And that's because of insights into the human nature and the human mind and the unconscious and anthropology and the other elements, existentialism, as we've seen, the other elements that inform this period. So wonderful period, tremendously productive. And I'll try and give you some good links to all of these people. And I encourage you to try and find some of these other modernist artists as well, because there's lots of good stuff to see here. Okay, so I'll see you next week.